When fifth-generation grower Elias Rourke embedded ultraviolet tracking powder inside his stolen vintage squash, he never expected to unravel a sprawling agricultural conspiracy led by the largest organic distributor on the East Coast. What started as a desperate move to stop mysterious crop thefts on his family's ancestral land would ripple into federal investigations, viral media storms, and a nationwide reckoning around food integrity. The morning began, like most others, with a mist clinging to the trees just outside the sleepy town of Bellwood Hollow. But for Elias, something was already wrong. Standing in the middle of his worn, sun-beaten fields, he stared at the precisely stripped rows where his most prized crop, striped Romanesco squash, renowned for their brilliant texture and rare seeds, had vanished overnight once again. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the crows circling above. He crouched, pressing his rough fingers into the dirt near the stems, each clean cut confirming what he feared. This was no random act. These were no scavengers. Someone was harvesting these plants with surgical accuracy, avoiding the younger fruit and even bypassing other varieties altogether. Elias had been farming these 100 acres on the edge of Cumberland Valley all his life, following in the footsteps of his father, grandfather, and those before them. The Rourke family had been farming this stretch since the early 1900s, holding firm through droughts, dust storms, and the rise of factory farming. Elias had shifted the operation to certified organic nearly 2 decades ago, a move that kept the farm alive when traditional crop prices dipped. Now that same decision seemed to have made them a target. "Pops," came a voice behind him, soft but direct. Ava Rourke, 33 years old and quick-witted like her late mother, joined him between the rows, a tablet tucked under one arm, hair pulled back tight as always. 6 months earlier, she'd stepped away from her career at a major agricultural consultancy in Denver to help save the family farm from financial collapse. She'd already brought a level of precision and modernization Elias had never imagined. But no amount of graphs or forecasts could fix this. "They were here again," she said flatly, scanning the scene. This time they skipped the entire southern bed. Must have known it hadn't ripened yet. Elias nodded, lips pressed thin. "Third time this month," he muttered. He didn't need to say more. Ava was already pulling up numbers. "At current yield estimates, that's nearly 4,000 in produce we've lost," she said. "And we're running out of wiggle room." She paused, scanning the financial dashboard. "We've got a 7-week runway before the bank freezes the operating line. Miss another payment, and they'll seize the equipment." She looked up. "I saw Martin yesterday. He asked again about our irrigation rights. Said the company would let us lease back the land if we signed over the water. Think they're behind this?" Elias rubbed his temple, looking toward the distant border of their land, where pristine rows of monoculture crops stretched endlessly. Property now owned by Caldera Grow Systems, the industrial ag behemoth that had quietly bought every farm within 10 miles. Only the Rourkes remained. "They want us out, no question," he said. "They've been pushing us for years. Now they're just playing rougher." Ava's jaw tightened. "They don't want the land. They want the aquifer. We're the last one sitting on direct access. Once they've got that, they control the valley," Elias finished. Later that evening, under the amber glow of workshop lights, Elias assembled what looked like a contraption born from desperation and late nights. Camera lenses, wires, a cluster of trail sensors, but most notably, small vials of ultraviolet reactive powder, harmless to humans, invisible in daylight, but radiant under blacklight. "You're really gonna do it?" Ava asked, setting down a fresh mug of coffee beside him. "Got no choice," Elias replied, sliding a chip into a small transmitter no bigger than a coin. If law enforcement won't take it seriously, maybe we'll find out where the squash ends up ourselves. The plan had formed out of frustration after their last insurance claim was denied under a clause buried in agricultural theft exemptions. No drones, no patrols, and no hope from local law enforcement. Their only option, catch the supply chain. Not the thieves themselves, perhaps, but the route the produce took after leaving their fields. Elias's system would mark selected squash with a faint UV residue and attach micro-trackers inside the stems, their signal pinging through a low-energy mesh to a monitoring app that Ava had helped cobble together with the help of Wyatt Chen, a tech-savvy high school grad from down the road. They worked late into the night, stepping carefully among the rows under the silver wash of moonlight, implanting the trackers one by one. The powder was hidden in the bloom end, ready to cling to gloves, baskets, crates, anything the thieves touched. 3 nights passed in silence. Elias checked the signal obsessively, eyes red from sleepless worry. By dawn on the 4th day, something changed. The app lit up with motion. Pings blinking like distress calls. "Ava!" he shouted, already pulling on his boots. Within minutes, they were racing down the gravel road in his aging truck, watching the trackers shift east, not just moving, but moving fast. Whoever took the squash was in a vehicle, possibly a van or transport truck. "They're on Route 72, Ava said, eyes scanning her tablet. "They're headed into the city." They followed, careful to stay distant, the signal bouncing steadily from roadside towers. After an hour, they reached the outskirts of Meridian City, a sprawling urban mass whose western districts were home to distribution warehouses and logistics hubs. They stopped, Elias said, pulling into a gas station across from a large, well-secured facility surrounded by fencing and trucks. A sign overhead read, "Meridian Organics Distribution, certified excellence in every bite." Ava's expression darkened. "They're the biggest organic distributor in this quadrant. We sold to them once, years ago." Elias lowered the window, watching as workers moved in and out of the warehouse. Why would they take stolen crops? Because they're not just selling organics, Ava replied, her voice low. They're blending, mixing real organic with conventional. It lets them pass tests while keeping margins sky high. They parked out of sight and watched. Several crates, unmarked but familiar, were offloaded into the facility. "That's Wyatt's harvest bin design," Ava whispered. "The ones we helped him 3D print last season." What they witnessed over the next hour erased all doubt. Produce marked with their powder was handled, washed, and repackaged into pristine cartons bearing the Meridian Organic seal. Ava flicked on her small UV flashlight, briefly sweeping it across the window from where they watched. The glow was unmistakable. Their squash, their powder, on gloves, crates, even the conveyor belts. "We've got to get this on video," Elias muttered. And they did, every frame, every glow. By the time they returned to the farm, their truck coated in dust and their minds tangled with adrenaline, the air had shifted. It wasn't just about stolen squash anymore. They had seen something bigger. Calculated fraud, systemic, coordinated, and quietly devastating. The weight of it all settled in Elias's chest like a stone. That night, after uploading the footage and syncing it with the tracker logs, they sat in the farmhouse kitchen surrounded by notes, screenshots, timestamps, and sensor data, trying to stitch everything into something coherent. Their first thought was to go to the county sheriff, but they already knew how that would play out. Sheriff Middleton had made it clear he didn't have the resources to pursue crop theft, especially without direct suspects. But now, with this footage, this undeniable evidence, they were dealing with something that went far beyond petty crime. "We're looking at fraud on a distribution scale," Ava said as she layered the video clips with a geographic overlay from the tracking system. They're laundering conventional produce through small organic operations like ours, but without paying for it. Our stuff, Miguel's peppers, all of it. The scope made her pause. This isn't just Meridian Organics, this could go higher. Caldera higher. Elias stared out the window, toward the dark outlines of their fields. And if they've been doing it for years, he said slowly, then we've been losing more than money. We've been competing against our own stolen produce. Ava nodded grimly. Exactly. And every time a customer buys a falsely labeled organic tomato from Meridian, it undercuts the real farmers, the ones doing it right. The next morning came with a haze of exhaustion. Elias hadn't slept. Neither had Ava. Just as they were setting out to contact the state agricultural department, Elias's phone pinged with an alert. Wyatt Chen, who had helped design the tracking system, had uploaded a video to his social media channel. The title was as bold as it was simple. Farmer builds trap, catches organic fraud ring. The short clip combined animated maps, time-stamped data, and footage from their midnight stakeout. By mid-morning, it had gone viral, bouncing from one platform to the next, shared by food bloggers, environmental activists, and skeptical. Consumers nationwide. They hadn't even submitted their case to regulators yet, but already the public was reacting. 300,000 views, Ava whispered, as she refreshed the browser, and climbing. By late afternoon, the number had more than tripled. Messages flooded in. Reporters, fellow farmers, strangers wanting to know if their produce might be fake too. And then, nestled among the messages, came one from a woman named Rowan Easton, special investigator with the Federal Food Integrity Division. "Call me immediately," it read. Elias did. Within 24 hours, Agent Easton stood in their kitchen, a portfolio of federal documentation spread across the table, her demeanor sharp, inquisitive, and focused. She'd seen the video, so had her entire department. "Your evidence is substantial," she said, flipping through the images Ava had printed. "We've suspected a certification laundering operation for a while, but lacked a point of entry. You may have just opened the door." Over the next 2 hours, they walked her through everything: the thefts, the trackers, the glowing powder, the real-time app data, and the distribution warehouse. As Easton's colleagues arrived to collect forensic samples and secure copies of the footage, a strange sense of momentum took hold. Something was finally happening. It wasn't just their problem anymore. Word spread faster than they could keep up. That night, national media picked up the story. The video now surpassed 1 million views, the phrase, "farm to fraud," trending across social feeds. Elias was uncomfortable with the attention. He wasn't a hero. He was a tired farmer who had duct-taped a few gadgets together to stop losing his livelihood. But to the public, he was the man who'd cracked open the facade of trust in the organic label. Ava handled most of the interviews, sharp and composed as always, delivering sound bites that turned heads. "Consumers pay more because they believe in those standards," she said in one segment. "Farmers spend years maintaining certifications because we believe in those practices. If distributors can fake that with stolen goods, the whole system collapses." The ripple effects began almost immediately. Within 2 days, several retailers announced temporary suspensions of their contracts with the Meridian Organics pending verification. The USDA opened an inquiry. The Department of Justice issued subpoenas. Organic certifiers found themselves under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Agent Easton and her team followed the trail the Rourkes had laid, uncovering additional connections, documents hidden in plain sight showing shell transactions, falsified invoices, and coordinated movements between Caldera Grow Systems and several regional distributors. "This goes deep," she told Elias during one of her follow-up visits. "We believe multiple entities were involved, and we think Caldera was more than just an indirect beneficiary." When Elias asked why Meridian would risk something so elaborate, Easton answered simply, "Because the profit margin between conventional and certified organic can be over double. Multiply that across thousands of tons, and you've got motive." Elias tried not to think about what might have happened if they'd never caught on. How many other farms had folded under mysterious market pressure or unexplained thefts? He remembered Miguel Torres, whose specialty peppers had vanished 2 seasons in a row, and Layla Chow, who had lost 3 contracts after failing to deliver her rare kale varieties. Now they were coming forward. One by one, they showed up at the Rourke farm, bringing logs, photos, strange patterns they'd dismissed until now, the same precise thefts, the same patterns of high-value produce disappearing under cover of darkness. "They took my bi-colored heirlooms," Layla said, pointing to the data overlays Ava had created. "Just the ones at full ripeness. Who else would know the exact harvest window?" Elias didn't have to answer. They all knew now. With the government involved and public interest at a fever pitch, a new kind of pressure emerged, one from the corporate side. Caldera issued a statement denying any involvement, claiming a rogue distributor may have sourced produce from unknown channels. Meridian shuttered its main warehouse for maintenance. Stock prices dipped, then plummeted, but the truth was already out. Consumers had started scanning their groceries with blacklight flashlights. Dozens of videos circulated online showing glowing produce, glowing gloves, glowing crates. The powder, so small, so harmless, had clung to everything. Elias watched, astonished, as people in cities he'd never visited inspected their cherry tomatoes and squash, finding his trace. "It spread through their whole system," Ava said, half in disbelief. "They must have washed everything together." The FDA expanded the investigation across 3 states. Whistleblowers emerged. A former warehouse supervisor confessed on live television that they'd been instructed to mix certified organic with regular produce to meet demand. Elias and Ava were invited to testify before a regional agricultural oversight panel. Not long after that, they were flown to Washington. "You're the reason we have this case," Agent Easton told Elias just before the hearing. "Your footage, your data, your powder, it gave us the thread to pull." But Elias didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. He missed quiet mornings, the smell of turned soil, the rhythm of planting and harvesting without fear of betrayal. And yet, deep down, he understood. If they hadn't done this, if they hadn't fought back, it would have continued, unnoticed, unchecked. The hearing room was grander than Elias expected. Ornate wood paneling, flags in every corner, microphones that hissed at the wrong angle. He wore his best shirt, clean jeans, and the boots he always wore. Ava stood beside him, polished, articulate, the living future of the farm. She guided him through their prepared statement. But when the time came to speak, Elias looked up at the rows of officials and lawmakers and spoke from somewhere deeper. "I didn't set out to catch a crime ring," he said slowly. "I just wanted to protect my vegetables, my family, my land." His voice, steadied. "But we learned the thefts weren't random. They were calculated. We were competing against our own stolen crops, sold under our label without our consent. That's not just theft. That's betrayal of every farmer who plays by the rules." The room was still when he finished. Lawmakers leaned forward, some nodded, others scribbled notes. It was Ava who closed their statement. "If we want to preserve organic integrity," she said, "we need systems that verify every step, not just trust, proof, real, accessible verification. Later that night, in their hotel room, Elias stared at the television as news anchors replayed clips of his testimony. One network had already called it the most important agricultural fraud case of the decade, but he didn't care about headlines. He cared that the squash thieves wouldn't return, that maybe, just maybe, other farmers could breathe easier because of what they'd done. By the time autumn settled fully into Bellwood Hollow, the farm was no longer a quiet corner of the world. What had once been just a generational patch of earth had become a nexus, an intersection of regulatory action, investigative journalism, and the furious optimism of small producers finally feeling like someone, somewhere, was listening. The government hadn't wasted time. Following the Rourke's testimony and the overwhelming public response, federal investigations widened. The fraud network began to crack open in real time. Elias watched from his kitchen as new headlines scrolled across the television every morning. Terms like organic laundering, distribution fraud, and certification manipulation suddenly became part of the national lexicon. Grocery chains suspended supplier relationships. Entire lots of produce were pulled from shelves. Farmers who had been ignored now had reporters in their fields. And the epicenter of it all, strange as it was, remained their farm. Every day brought a new kind of visitor: researchers, policy aides, even filmmakers. Elias took it all in stride, a man grounded by decades of early mornings and aching knees. But it was Ava who shouldered most of the attention. She'd emerged as a de facto spokesperson, navigating interviews and stakeholder meetings with a quiet authority that turned heads. She spoke for the farmers who were too tired, too skeptical, or too bitter to keep fighting. She understood their language, and she spoke it fluently in conference rooms where decisions were made. Still, the real work hadn't stopped. The produce kept growing. The land kept asking to be tended. So, while the nation argued about verification and the USDA revised certification frameworks, Elias was still out in the fields before sunrise, coaxing life from the soil that had always answered his efforts with something tangible. Except now, the work felt different. Not heavier, necessarily, but marked. Each crate of squash or kale or beets they packed now carried more than flavor and nutrition. It carried meaning. And with every scan from a customer's phone, thanks to the new verification app designed around Wyatt's original prototype, that meaning was reinforced. Trust, no longer abstract, had been made trackable. One particular afternoon, just as the leaves began their full gold and rust transformation, a long black SUV made its way up the gravel drive. Elias had grown used to these arrivals, but this one was different. Out stepped Martin Kessler, Regional Operations Manager from Caldera Grow Systems, a man who had, once upon a time, offered to relieve the Rourkes of their property with a smirk and a contract. His arrival now, without the usual entourage or pretense, carried a strange energy. "Mr. Rourke," he greeted, hat in hand, voice low. "Mind if I speak with you a moment?" Elias narrowed his eyes but nodded toward the barn. They walked without speaking. Inside the barn, with shafts of sunlight filtering through the ancient slats, Kessler came clean. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. He confessed to knowing more than he'd admitted, that the crop thefts were part of a much larger strategy, one not just about produce but about land, more specifically about water. "Your well taps directly into the Cumberland subbasin," he explained. "That aquifer's the last clean source that isn't under corporate control in this region. The thefts were never about the squash, Elias. They were pressure." Elias didn't move, didn't speak. Kessler filled the silence. Caldera's long game was to devalue the independents, make farming impossible, then swoop in and offer help. Land for lease. Equipment discounts, but only after we controlled the water. Elias still didn't respond, just stared at him with something unreadable in his eyes. "I'm cooperating now," Kessler said finally, "with the FFI division. Immunity in exchange for full disclosure. I wanted you to hear it from me before the rest becomes public record." Then he left, the barn door creaking shut behind him, leaving Elias standing alone in a place filled with the ghosts of memory, betrayal echoing louder than any tractor. The confirmation changed everything. Agent Rowan Easton arrived again, this time not with folders, but with federal warrants. Within 72 hours, Caldera's regional offices were raided. Documents were seized. Executives subpoenaed. Meanwhile, the verification system the Rourkes had inspired was no longer a patchwork of experimental trackers and DIY sensors. It was being codified into policy. The Department of Agriculture fast-tracked new legislation, backed by bipartisan sponsors and a rare alignment of lobbyists and reformers alike. The proposed act would standardize transparent produce verification, fund supply chain audits, and, perhaps most significantly, establish protections for whistleblower farms. It wasn't just a win, it was a turning point. The Rourkes weren't alone anymore. Farmers from other states reached out with similar stories: strange thefts, inexplicable shortfalls, fluctuating demand that didn't make sense. One by one, these scattered data points found their way to Ava, who had begun compiling them into a central archive. She formed a coalition with Miguel, Layla, and a dozen others. They called it the Authentic Producers Network, a loose confederation of small, organic farmers committed to transparency and mutual defense. By the end of the season, their collective included nearly 200 producers, all integrating the Rourke-inspired tracking model into their operations. Wyatt, the kid genius who'd helped rig the original tracker, now had a job he never expected: head of technology for the network. His system, once cobbled together on second-hand parts and open-source code, had matured into a robust platform. Every verified product bore a unique marker, some invisible to the eye, some embedded in packaging, all traceable to its source. Not just to the farm, but to the field, to the row, to the day it was harvested. And with that level of transparency came something the food system hadn't seen in generations: real trust, born from proof. Retailers began to take notice, not just the boutique grocers or direct-to-consumer co-ops, but national chains, eager to align themselves with the growing demand for authenticity. "Consumers don't just want organic anymore," Ava told one news outlet. "They want origin, story, proof of practice." The market responded. Verified goods started to fetch a premium, not because of marketing spin, but because they could show exactly what they were. And slowly, something incredible began to happen. The balance shifted. Farmers started setting terms again. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to feel it. Then came the summit. Not a formal event, but a gathering held right there in Bellwood Hollow, in the very fields where it all started. Tents were erected. Journalists arrived. Politicians made speeches. But most importantly, farmers came. Some from just up the road, others from across the country. Elias stood on a small wooden platform built beside the old squash beds and looked out over the crowd. "We didn't plan any of this," he began, his voice scratchy with emotion. "We just got tired of being lied to, tired of working hard, only to have someone else profit off our name. This verification, it's not a weapon. It's a mirror. It shows the truth, and the truth is, we're still here." The applause that followed wasn't raucous. It was steady, solid. the sound of people recognizing their own struggle in someone else's story. That night, under strings of borrowed lights and over long tables of shared food, strangers became allies. A movement, once accidental, became something larger, an unspoken promise that those who fed the world deserved more than survival. They deserved sovereignty. They deserved truth. And as Elias stepped away from the noise, out into the quiet of his back field, the stars above felt a little closer. The land felt familiar again. Not safe, perhaps, but seen. The frost came early that year, painting the edges of the fields with silver lace and drawing tight around the bones of the valley. For Elias Rourke, the cold carried less weight than it used to. It didn't bite the same way. Not with the root cellars full, the accounts in the black for the first time in years, and the knowledge that the ground beneath him no longer felt like contested territory. It was home again. The fields were quiet for now, just rows of kale and winter carrots left. The last of the season's work tucked into soil still soft enough to yield. But there was a kind of hush in the land, not from defeat, but from resolution, the kind of stillness that follows not an ending, but a shift. The summit had come and gone, but its momentum remained. Where once the Rourkes stood alone, now they were part of something vast. The Authentic Producers Network had grown beyond what Elias had imagined possible. Dozens of farmers had become hundreds, and hundreds had turned to thousands. The verification system, born of desperation, built on borrowed tech and faith, had become a permanent fixture in the language of food. Not a trend, but a standard. Not a gimmick, but a safeguard. No one laughed at the trackers anymore. No one questioned the powder. Instead, other industries had come asking. Coffee cooperatives from Guatemala, rice growers in the Philippines, olive oil producers in the Mediterranean. They wanted help tracing their own chains, making their own harvests visible. Ava now spent half her time on video calls with partners across continents, explaining the system, adapting the protocols, overseeing app development with engineers who referred to her as the architect. The title fit. Her calm, her clarity, the way she spoke of value, not in metrics but in meaning, had become its own kind of currency. She hadn't left the farm, though. That was the deal. No matter how big the network grew, no matter how far the verification project reached, the farm remained home. Every week, she walked the rows. Every week, she touched the leaves. That was non-negotiable. And Elias, watching her move through the fields with boots sunk in frost and tablet in hand, knew the legacy had found its next bearer. As for Wyatt, the kid from down the road who once used to patch together gadgets in a garage lit by string lights, he now ran a full-blown software lab out of the renovated dairy barn. What used to store bales and buckets was now humming with processors, coding stations, and live data feeds from over 1,000 farms. His interface had been adopted in 3 countries, and 2 more were in pilot. But he still made time to swing by Elias's place at dusk, sitting on the porch and drinking sweet tea like nothing had changed. He never bragged, never called himself a pioneer, but the world knew. And Elias, never one for big talk, had quietly grown to love watching someone so young carry the torch without burning out. One evening, as the horizon turned purple and the chickens tucked themselves in, a letter arrived by courier, hand-delivered, sealed with the emblem of the United Nations. Elias opened it slow, his thick fingers careful with the envelope. Inside, an invitation. The verification framework born at Rourke Farm was to be presented at the International Agricultural Transparency Forum in Geneva, not as an exhibit, as the keynote model. Ava would speak. Wyatt would demonstrate. And Elias, he was asked to come and share the origin story, not the science, not the policy, just the moment it all began. The why, the spark, the man who hid tracking powder in a squash. The flight to Switzerland was quiet. Snow along the Alps, distant lights that flickered like stars fallen to earth. Elias sat by the window in a borrowed coat and tried to imagine explaining the soul of farming to a room full of global delegates. But when the day came, and the chamber filled with rows of languages and faces and expectations, he rose slowly, stepped behind the podium, and told the truth. "I never meant to start a movement," he said, his voice soft but sure. "I was trying to catch a thief. Someone kept taking the food I grew with my own hands, and I wanted to know who, so I left a mark they couldn't wash off. I followed that mark, and what we found, was that the theft wasn't just in the fields, it was in the chain, in the silence, in the places where truth disappeared between grower and buyer. So we built something that could hold the truth in place. That's all verification is. A light you can shine to see what's real." There was no applause at first, just stillness. Then a slow, rising wave of hands coming together, real, not performative, not political. It was the applause of people who knew the truth of what he'd said, who had in their own ways lived it. Back at the farm, the winter passed gently. The ground held. The wells stayed clean. Caldera had been dismantled, its leadership indicted, its assets broken into pieces. Some were absorbed by regional cooperatives, others were sold to debt-clearing trusts, but the land around Bellwood Hollow had shifted hands. Many of those hands were now small, family-run, young again. The corporate pressure that once loomed over the valley had vanished, chased off not by lawsuits, but by light. Verification had made it unprofitable to lie, and when spring returned, it came without fear. Seedlings reached without hesitation. Contracts were signed with joy rather than resignation. Elias found himself walking longer in the fields, not because he had to, but because he could. He watched the bees come back, fat and lazy in the morning sun. He watched Ava laugh with new interns, the sound rising like the wind. He watched the barn, once quiet, now alive with data and dreaming, and felt something in his chest finally unclench. A decade later, when the Smithsonian called again, Ava said yes. The original tracker, a weathered little device no bigger than a coin, still faintly stained with the first batch of UV powder, was placed in a glass case beneath soft light. The plaque read, "The beginning of the verification revolution." Elias didn't go to the unveiling. He didn't need to. The story had already been told, and more importantly, it was still being written. In the end, there were no grand speeches, no medals, just another harvest. Another row, another morning where Elias Rourke rose before the sun, poured his coffee, and stepped into the fields. He bent to the soil, checked the moisture, whispered something to the leaves. He didn't know if it was a prayer or a promise. Maybe both. And when he stood again, looking across the valley now dotted with farms that had once been fated to vanish, he felt the quiet kind of pride that lives deep in the chest. Not for what he had done, but for what had been protected, for what would last. Because what began as a trap for stolen squash had turned into a safeguard for truth. And in that truth, the future had taken root.